The nurse woke me up after surgery and said something it would take me months to fully understand. Your son went home. He told the front desk you had other arrangements. I was lying in a hospital bed. One eye was taped shut. Other arrangements? I could barely follow what she was saying, because there were no other arrangements. Nobody was coming to pick me up. No family was on the way. There was no backup plan. Just a 63-year-old man in a hospital gown, with $31 in his wallet, a car sitting in a driveway 11 miles away, and one eye the doctor wouldn't let him use until morning. I couldn't drive. I couldn't even find my own way home, and the one person I trusted to come get me had just left me there. My name is Curtis Meade. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and I spent 29 years as a probation officer for Jefferson County before I retired. 29 years. Do you know what that job actually is? It isn't handcuffs. It's sitting in a folding chair across from somebody once a month while they explain to you why the thing they did wasn't really the thing they did. I have heard, and I am being conservative, somewhere north of 11,000 explanations. I have heard men explain away a stolen truck, a broken jaw, a missed child support payment, and a house fire. I got very good at hearing the exact half-second where a person stops describing what happened and starts describing a version of it. So I want you to understand that when I tell you what my son said to me afterward, and he said a lot, I knew precisely which parts he believed. That's the part that hurts. Not that he lied to me. That most of it, he'd already sold to himself. The surgery was nothing. That's the first thing people get wrong when I tell this. Cataract, right eye, outpatient, 40 minutes. They give you something to take the edge off. They do the work. You sit in recovery. And then somebody drives you home because you cannot legally or practically drive yourself with one eye dilated to the size of a dime. That's the rule. There's a form. Somebody signs it. Bryce signed it. My son. 40 years old, commercial insurance broker, lives out in Middletown with a wife I've met maybe 9 times, and 2 kids I see at Christmas. He called me the Sunday before, on his own, unprompted. He said, "Dad, I've got you Thursday. Don't even think about it. Don't even think about it." I'd been trying to figure out the ride for 2 weeks. I'd nearly canceled the whole thing twice. And when he offered, I want to tell you honestly what I felt, because it's embarrassing. I felt proud of him. I got off that call and sat in my kitchen in old Louisville, in a shotgun house I've owned since 1994, and I felt this warm, stupid thing in my chest, because my son had noticed something I needed, and had stepped into it without being asked. He was quiet on the drive over Thursday morning. I noticed. I've been noticing for a living since 1991. He was quiet, and he checked his phone at every light. And when I made a joke about how I'd finally be able to read a menu without holding it at arm's length, he laughed about a beat and a half late. I filed it. I did not act on it. That's the thing about a trained ear. It doesn't help you when the person is your own kid. You hear the wrong note, and then you immediately supply a reason for it, because the alternative is standing in a hallway at 7:40 in the morning saying, "Times what's going on with you times to a grown man who's doing you a favor." He walked me in. He sat down in the waiting area with a coffee. That's the last time I saw him that day, though it wasn't the last time he saw me. Here's what I found out later, from a nurse named Delphine, who was gentle about it and shouldn't have had to be. About 25 minutes after they took me back, Bryce went to the front desk. He said something had come up at work. He said his father had another ride arranged for pickup. He gave them his cell number for the family contact line. And he left. And then, and this is the part I still can't fully hold in my hand, he did not leave the property. He drove to the far end of the lot, by the retention pond, and he sat there for 2 hours and 10 minutes. I know this because it's on the parking facility's camera, and it got entered into a court record in February, and I have watched the timestamp advance on that footage more times than is good for a person. He sat out there waiting to see whether his father figured something out. Delphine woke me up in recovery. I remember the ceiling tiles, and I remember that my mouth tasted like a penny. And I said, "Is my son out there?" And she got this look. Nurses have a specific face for information that isn't medical but is still going to hurt you. And I have enormous respect for the fact that they don't try to hide it. She told me, and I said, "Okay, thank you." That's what I said. "Okay, thank you." Because I'm 63 years old and I have spent my entire life being fine in front of professionals. If you have ever received bad news and immediately reassured the person delivering it, if your first instinct has ever been to manage the other person's discomfort while your own floor is dropping out, then you and I are four as end, the same kind of animal, and I don't know if that's a virtue or a defect. I've stopped trying to decide. They discharged me at 1:40 inches the afternoon into the main lobby of the Jefferson Surgical Pavilion. Now here's what nobody in this story ever quite appreciates, including me at the time. I couldn't see. That eye was dilated wide open and taped under a plastic shield, and the other one was doing all the work, and everything past about 8 feet was a smear. They give you these enormous wraparound sunglasses that make you look like a beekeeper. The lobby had a wall of south-facing glass, and the light coming through it was like a knife. I could not read my phone screen. I tried for probably 4 minutes. I could not read the bus schedule on the wall by the doors. I had $31, because I'd left my wallet's contents mostly at home the way you do when you're going in for surgery, and I had a phone at 11% with no charger, and I had a house 11 miles away, in a direction I could not currently navigate. So I sat down in a padded chair near that window, and I started doing arithmetic. A cab or a rideshare from there to Old Louisville is somewhere around $24 plus tip, and I could do that. That was actually solvable. That's not the part that got me. What got me was that I sat there and went through my contact list in my head, not my phone, my head, because I couldn't read my phone looking for a person. Pearl next door was in Ocala with her daughter until the 11th. My brother Lonnie was 25 minutes away in Prospect, and I would rather have crawled home on the shoulder of Eastern Parkway. There were 3 men I'd worked with for 2 decades, and I hadn't spoken to any of them since 2021. And I sat in that chair and I thought, very clearly, in a voice that didn't sound panicked at all, there is nobody. 29 years of public service, 40 years of paying my taxes and mowing my grass and showing up. And on a Thursday afternoon in October, I could not produce one name. That's not the part where somebody wrongs you. That's the part where you find out what you built. I sat there about 20 minutes, and I want to be honest about what was happening in me, because I think people expect grief, and it wasn't grief. It was times shame. Enormous, hot, total shame. Not at him, at me. Because a man whose son leaves him at a hospital must be, somewhere in the accounting, a man who earned that. That's the math your brain does automatically, and you cannot stop it. Then somebody spoke to me from my left. You've got the beekeeper glasses. I turned my head. There was a shape in a wheelchair about 6 feet away, and I genuinely could not resolve her face. White hair. A pale jacket. Very straight posture that I could tell even blurred, because posture is a silhouette. I said something like, "They don't let you pick. They never do." A pause. Right eye? Right eye. I had both done in 2019. The second one was easier because I knew what to expect. Another pause. And then she said, in exactly the same conversational register, "Your ride left, didn't he?" I didn't answer. "I've been over there since 11, she said. "I come every Wednesday and every other Thursday for an infusion. I sit in that alcove and I watch the room, because there's nothing else to do, and I've never been able to read in a lobby. A beat. The young man who walked you in went out at about 9:10. He didn't come back. And then, and this is the thing that broke something open in me, she didn't say anything sympathetic. She said, "I need a favor." I said, "Ma'am, I'm not in much of a position to. My driver's pulling around in about 4 minutes, and I've got a problem. Nita usually rides in with me, and she's out with her mother today, and Vernon can't push the chair and manage the door and the ramp at the same time without leaving me parked in a traffic lane like luggage." She let that sit exactly 1 second. "I need somebody to push this chair to the car. And then I'm going to need to drop you wherever you're going, because I'm not letting a man push my chair and then walk off into a parking lot half blind. That's not how I was raised." I sat there, and I want to slow this all the way down, because this is where the whole rest of my life turned, and it turned on about 11 words. "I need somebody to push this chair." She didn't offer me a ride. She gave me a job. I have thought about that for 2 years, and I understand now exactly what happened in that lobby. That woman had been sitting across a room watching a proud man discover he had nobody to call, and she understood instantly, without being told, from 6 feet away through a pair of ridiculous sunglasses, that if she offered me help I would say no. I would have. I want to be clear. If she had rolled over and said, "Times, you poor thing, let me get you home," I'd have said, "No thank you, ma'am. I've got it handled," and I'd have sat in that chair another 40 minutes, and then paid $24 I could not really spare. She knew that. So she manufactured a task and put me in it. That is the single most respectful thing anyone has ever done for me. If you have ever needed help and could not physically make your mouth accept it, if you've watched a parent refuse a meal, refuse a ride, refuse money, and get angry times about being offered, then you already understand what she did. She didn't lower herself to my pride. She built a doorway that pride could walk through. I said, "I can push a chair." "I know you can," she said. "That's why I asked you, and not the young man by the vending machine." Her name was Adelaide Ferris, 82 years old. Vernon came through the automatic doors, right on time, tall, dark jacket, 60s, moved like a man who has done the same job well for a long time. He said, "Mrs. Ferris." Then he looked at me for about a quarter second and said, "Sir," and held the door, and never once asked who I was, which I later learned is a specific professional skill. I pushed that chair across the lobby and out into October. And here's where it happened. The vehicle was a black SUV, one of the big quiet ones, parked in the loading zone. And as Vernon was getting the ramp down, I looked out across that parking lot with one working eye, and about 90 yards away, over by the retention pond, I saw a silver sedan. I knew that car. I could not have read the plate to save my life. But I've known the shape of that car for 6 years. And the driver's door was open, and my son was standing in the gap between the door and the frame with one hand on the roof, looking straight at me. We looked at each other across a parking lot. I couldn't see his face. That's the truth of it. And it's almost funny, the most important 60 seconds of my life, and I could not resolve my own son's expression at 90 yards. But I could see his posture. And his posture was the posture of a man who had been sitting in a car for 2 hours constructing something and had just had it taken apart. He raised his hand. Not a wave. Something that started as a wave and stopped. I got in the car. Vernon shut the door, and it made that heavy, sealed sound that expensive doors make, and the noise of the world just stopped. Air conditioning. Some kind of quiet string music. The smell of leather, and something like bergamot. And we pulled out. I looked out the tinted glass as we went past. He'd stepped fully out of his car by then. He was saying something. I couldn't hear one syllable of it. Then we turned onto the road, and he was gone. Mrs. Ferris said, "Was that him?" I said it was. She looked out her own window for a moment and said, "Well, he didn't look pleased with himself. That's better than the alternative." And I laughed. I actually laughed, in the back of a stranger's car, 40 minutes after the worst afternoon of my adult life. Then I said, "You didn't need help with the chair." "No," she said. "Vernon's been doing that ramp alone since 2011. "Then why?" And she turned and looked at me. And even with one eye and a smear, I could see that she'd gone somewhere else. "Because in 1996 my daughter sat in a waiting room at a hospital in Lexington for 4 hours, she said. And everybody who was supposed to be there for her that day made a decision not to be, including for 3 of those hours, me." She folded her hands. "I've had a long time to think about what one person sitting down next to her would have changed. So now I sit down next to people. It's not complicated, and it isn't charity. It's just the only thing I found that helps." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything. We drove out I-71, and then off onto a 2-lane and then onto a private lane lined with old bur oaks, up in Oldham County, in that part of Kentucky, where the fences are all black plank and the fields roll like something breathing. And at the end of the lane there was a house. Now I'm going to be careful here, because I could spend 4 minutes describing that house and it wouldn't tell you anything true. So I'll say this. It was brick. It was old. It was long. And there was a limestone spring house down the slope that predated the Civil War. And there was a stand of sycamores by the water that I would later learn her husband had refused to cut for a driveway in 1979, which cost him about $40,000 in rerouting. I said, "This is where you live." Since 1978. Hal built the second wing when the company got its legs under it. She was quiet a second. "I've had it listed in my head about 9 times. Never once actually called anybody." A woman met us at the door. Nita Brill, mid-50s, ran the household. and she looked at me with the exact expression of a professional encountering an unscheduled variable and deciding, in real time, to be gracious about it. She asked if I'd be staying for supper, and Mrs. Ferris said yes before I got my mouth open. We ate in a dining room that could have held my entire probation unit. Pork tenderloin, greens, cornbread in a black skillet, and a bottle of wine. I later found out cost more than my first car, a '78 Nova I paid $400 for. And she talked to me like she'd known me 20 years. She asked about the job, what the caseload was actually like, whether I thought any of it worked. And when I answered, she times listened. I need to explain what I mean by that, because it's the second most important thing that happened to me that day. Most people listen the way you idle at a light. They're waiting. You can feel the engine running underneath it. She wasn't waiting. She asked a follow-up question about recidivism among people with stable housing that was better than any question I got in 29 years of interagency meetings. I hadn't been listened to like that since my mother died in 2004. Somewhere around the greens I said, "I don't know your first name. Adelaide. Nobody calls you that. Nobody's called me that since Hal." A small pause. "You can if you want. I'd like to hear what it sounds like coming from somebody who isn't dead." After supper, Nita showed me to a room, and Adelaide said Vernon would run me home in the morning, that she had something she'd like to put to me first if I was willing to stay the night. And every single reflex I owned stood straight up. 30 years of don't be a burden. Don't inconvenience anybody. Make yourself the correct size for the space you've been allotted. And then I thought about a padded chair by a window and $31. I said I'd stay. I did not sleep. I lay in a bed with sheets that felt like something out of a hotel I couldn't afford, and I did what I do, which is look for the catch. Because listen, I ran a caseload for 29 years. Do you know how many times I've seen a lonely older person get taken by somebody kind? I have written the reports. I know the shape of that crime better than almost anybody. So I went back through the whole afternoon looking for the tell, and I could not find one. She hadn't asked me for anything. She hadn't touched a single subject that a person running an angle touches. She hadn't asked what I had, what I owned, who was in my will, or whether I had family who'd object. She'd asked what I thought about probation. In the morning, Nita brought coffee, and Adelaide came in walking with a cane instead of the chair, moving a great deal better than she had the day before, and she sat down across from me and drank about half her cup, looking out at the field before she said anything. Then she said, "I want to tell you about the company. Ferris Land Company. I knew the name the way you know names. It's on signs. It's on the side of buildings on Shelbyville Road. What I did not know was the size." She walked me through it plainly, not to impress me, just so I'd have the actual number. Farmland, commercial, industrial parks, a management division, a development arm, a small foundation. Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, and a chunk of southern Ohio, built over 51 years. She said the number was somewhere north of 240 million. I put my cup down, very carefully, on the saucer. "I'm telling you the number," she said, "so that when you say no, you'll be saying no to the actual thing, and not to something you imagined." I said, "What am I saying no to?" And she put both hands flat on the table. "I'm 82. Hal's been gone 12 years. My daughter's been gone 29. I have 2 grandchildren, Tess and Aaron, both in their late 30s, both good, both living their own lives in Denver and Chicago, and both of whom have told me directly and repeatedly that they do not want this business. And I believe them, and I don't hold it against them." She said she'd been looking for 3 years. Not for a manager, they had managers. For somebody to bring in and teach it to from the inside. Somebody who'd carry it the way it was built. Then she said, "And yesterday I sat in a lobby and watched a man get left, and watched him not say one unkind word about it to the nurse, and then watched him agree to push a wheelchair when he could barely see. And something in me said, pay attention. I'm not a woman who runs on feelings, but I've learned that when something's that loud, you don't argue with it." I said, "Adelaide, you don't know me. I know more than you'd guess. Nita ran a background check last night." He sat back. "I'd apologize," she said, "except I'd do it again. 29 years with the county. 2 commendations, no record, a mortgage with 11 years left, and nothing else outstanding. And 2 people who worked with you, whom I spoke to at 7:30 this morning. both of whom used the phrase times, straight arrow times without prompting. She tilted her head. That's enough to have a conversation. It isn't enough to hand you a company. That's what the next year would be for. I asked what it would actually look like. Salary during a training period. Not an employee, a partner in training. Learn the divisions, meet the people, understand how it all hangs together. And if she got where she thought she'd get, a formal partnership and eventually a place in her estate planning. I said, "You're talking about making me an heir." And she said, "I'm talking about giving 1 years of work somewhere to go." Those turn out to be the same sentence. I asked for an hour. She gave me a library with a window seat and left me alone in it. And I sat in there with one eye still blurry and thought about my life with the specific clarity you only get when the floor moves. I thought about Bryce. His mother and I split when he was 12, and she took him to Tulsa, and I drove out or flew out every chance the calendar allowed for 6 years. And it was never enough. And I know that, because it wasn't. 6 visits a year is not a father. It's a very consistent guest. And somewhere in there, he built a story about me. That I'd chosen something. What the something was, I could never get him to name. I asked him directly twice. Once when he was 19 and once at his rehearsal dinner. And both times he said, "Times forget it, Dad." He kept a ledger. That's what I finally understood. Sitting in that window seat. My son has been keeping a ledger on me since 1997. And in his accounting I'm overdrawn, and every year the interest compounds. And in that accounting, leaving a man at a hospital isn't cruelty. It's a withdrawal. That's the part I want you to sit with, because it's the part that makes this a real story instead of a cartoon. He didn't think he was abandoning me. He thought he was collecting. And Lonnie, my brother, 4 years younger, comfortable, married to a woman who's been very smart with money. We've been civil, and nothing else since our mother's estate got settled in 2018 inches, a way that left both of us privately, certain the other one had gotten over. I went back to the dining room and told her yes. Now, I'm going to move quickly through 8 months, because the good part of a story is never the part that goes well. Vernon drove me back and forth for the first few weeks, while I closed out a consulting thing and dealt with the tenant in my back unit. By January, I'd moved into the East Rooms, which felt absurd for about a month and then, gradually, stopped feeling like anything except where I lived. She was a hard teacher. Every morning after breakfast, a subject. How the ag leases were structured and why. Why they'd bought a dying strip center in 2009 and what they'd done with it. What she looked for in a property management team which, it turns out, is almost entirely how they talk about tenants when they think nobody's evaluating them. She had a mind like a card catalog and she expected me to keep up. And here's what surprised me. I could. 29 years of reading pre-sentence reports means you can absorb 100 pages and find the load-bearing sentence. A portfolio reads like a case file. It's just an argument somebody's been making with money for 50 years. Nita told me one night after Adelaide had gone up early, she said, "She's got something to do again. You gave her that." I didn't have an answer for that, so I just nodded and went to bed and lay there for a while. Bryce called in November. I watched his name come up and I felt the old reflex fire pick up. Smooth it over, make it easy. He let it ring. He called the next day. I let it ring. I answered the third one. "Dad, I've been trying you." That careful voice. The one people use when they're establishing aversion. "I heard you moved?" "Who from?" "Somebody from the old block." A pause. "Listen, about the surgery." "I want to explain." "You don't have to." "I do because I feel terrible about it. There was a thing at work, a big account, and I panicked, and I made a bad call. But I knew you'd figure it out. You always figure it out. I knew you'd figure it out. I have heard that sentence, or its cousin, roughly 400 times across a desk. It is the single most common structure in the English language for converting a thing you did into a compliment about the person you did it to. I said, I had $31 in one eye. Silence on the line. A long one. Then he said, "Where are you living?" And there it was. 4 seconds after the apology. I said I was well, that I'd found something that suited me, and that I thought we should give each other some room for a while. Room. He said the word like it was in a foreign language. "Dad, what's going on? People are saying you're out in Oldham County in some estate with a woman nobody's heard of. Is somebody taking advantage of you? Because if that's happening, I need to know. I'm your son. I've got a responsibility here. Responsibility? I stood up and walked to the window that looks down at the spring house. And I said, "You had one in October." He didn't say anything. I said, "Not yet." And I ended the call. I told Adelaide at supper because I'd learned she was the kind of person you could tell things to straight. She set her fork down and said, "He'll come out here. He doesn't know where here is. He'll find it. They always do." She picked her fork back up. When people feel like they're losing access to something, they show up. He doesn't need to know what's here. He knows something changed, and that's plenty. Lonnie got there first. Second Saturday in December, called up from the gate, and I have never found out how he got the address. Vernon called the house the way protocol says, and I stood in the hall for a good 30 seconds. Then I said, "Let him in." He came into the front room and did the thing. His eyes went up to the ceiling, across to the pictures, down the length of the room, and then to me, and I could read that sequence like a transcript because I've watched 1,000 men price a room they were standing in. Curtis. He was almost laughing. My God, I had no idea. He sat down without being asked. He's always done that. He said he wasn't there to pry. He said he knew we hadn't been close and that some of that was on him, and that he'd handled Mom's estate badly and had wanted to say so for a while. He had not wanted to say so for a while. If he'd wanted to say it, 7 years is a lot of Thanksgivings. But I sat down across from him and I did what Adelaide does, which is nothing. Silence is its own pressure. Most people will fill it with the truth if you just let them. It took him about 90 seconds. Rough year. An investment with his wife's brother that hadn't gone the way they'd modeled it. Not destitute, he wanted to be clear, but tighter than a man his age ought to be. And when I heard about all this, he said, opening a hand at the room, I thought maybe we could help each other out. Family helps family. You know how I feel about that. I did know how he felt about that. He'd felt that way whenever the direction of travel was toward him. I asked what he had in mind. He said a bridge, short term, and he said a number, and it was a real number. And I looked at my brother, 59 years old, same eyes as our father, a man whose entire childhood I was in the room for. And there was something real under all of it. There always is. There's almost always something real in people even when they're at their absolute worst, and I learned across 29 years that the realness doesn't obligate you one bit. I said, I can't do that. He blinked twice. I'm not in a position to lend money, and if I were, I'd want to think hard about it given the history. And the polite layer came off his face like a decal. The history. When I needed a roof in 2016, I asked you. When Rita left and I called you from a parking lot in 1998, I asked you. I kept my voice flat. Not cold. Flat. I'm not angry, Lonnie. I've been done being angry for a long time. I'm just being accurate. He stood up. His face went through about 4 things and settled on wounded dignity, which is his best one. I came here as your brother. I know. And I'm answering you as yours. He left. I watched Vernon walk him to his car from the window, and I felt that particular flat emptiness that comes from doing the right thing when the right thing still costs you something. Adelaide was in the sitting room. I hadn't known she was home. How much did you hear? Enough. A pause. You gave him more grace than he came with. He's my brother. Yes. And you still said no. She looked at me over her glasses. Not everybody can do that. Most people can't. January is when it got bad. A letter came through Adelaide's attorney's office, copied to the firm handling my arrangement. My son had filed a petition. It alleged that Adelaide Ferris was of diminished capacity, that she had been subject to undue influence by an individual me who had gained access to her through a chance encounter under circumstances that warranted scrutiny, that the financial arrangement between us should be reviewed by the court. And it asserted that as my next of kin, he had standing to intervene in estate matters concerning me. I sat at a kitchen table with that letter, and one thought went through me, and it wasn't rage. It was, he's made me a case file. I have written 1,000 of those sentences. Subject exhibits behavior consistent with. I know exactly what that language is for. It's for converting a person into a situation you can manage. Marguerite Doss came out the next day, Adelaide's attorney, mid-50s, unhurried, organized her information, the way the best teachers I ever met organized a lesson. Nothing decorative, nothing wasted. She said the capacity claim was the serious one. No factual basis, but it demands a response. I asked what they actually wanted. Right now? Fog. She capped her pen. If they can generate enough procedural uncertainty, they may believe you'll settle something to make it stop. She turned to Adelaide. Mrs. Ferris, they'll move for a cognitive evaluation. And Adelaide said, book it. Book 3. Then Marguerite said they'd likely call witnesses, staff, business associates, anybody who could speak to Adelaide's state of mind and to our relationship. Adelaide said, call every one of them. 2 weeks later, I learned that Lonnie had signed an affidavit supporting the petition. Under oath, my brother wrote that I'd been behaving erratically since the fall, that I had rebuffed family attempts to check on my welfare, that my association with Mrs. Ferris began under circumstances that raised serious questions. He described the hospital, my departure in the SUV, and his December visit, and he characterized my declining to lend him money as evidence of a personality change consistent with undue influence. Marguerite read it out loud to us in the study. When she finished, Adelaide said, "What a remarkably unflattering family portrait." I said I was sorry, and she said, "Curtis, don't ever apologize to me for what other people choose." The hearing was the 4th of February, and now I'm going to slow all the way down because I've gone through this morning in my head probably 200 times, and I can still tell you what the room smelled like. Jefferson County. A small courtroom, not a big one, wood paneling gone orange with age, radiators that knocked, and one high window with wire in the glass. Maybe 20 seats in the gallery, and 11 of them empty. I got there 40 minutes early. Habit. 29 years of showing up to court early. Bryce came in at 8:52 with his attorney, a man named Whit Cabler, who had the specific confidence of somebody who bills a lot and knows exactly what it buys. And my brother came in behind them and sat in the second row. Bryce did not look at me. Not once, all morning, until the end. But I looked at him. I looked at my son for a long time while we waited for the judge, and I'll tell you what I saw, because it wasn't a villain. He looked times thin. He looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in a couple of months. He kept squaring a stack of papers that didn't need squaring. Over and over, the same 3 taps. He was frightened. And here's the thing I had to sit with in that room, and I think it's the truest thing in this whole story. I don't believe my son's fear was fake. Look at it from the outside for 1 second. An isolated older man with no local support gets picked up at a hospital by a wealthy widow he's never met, moves into her house within 90 days, and stops taking calls. That is, and I say this as someone who has filed the reports, the exact shape of elder exploitation. He wasn't wrong about the shape. He was wrong about who was in it. And the other thing was true too, that every day I stayed out there, something he'd been counting on since 1997 got further away from him. Both things were in that man at the same time, and I do not believe he could tell them apart, and I don't think he can today. That's what makes it unbearable instead of simple. Marguerite went first. Medical records. 5 years of them. Then the cognitive evaluation Adelaide had gone and taken voluntarily 8 days earlier. The evaluating physician testified a woman from the university, and she said flatly that Mrs. Ferris presented no indication of cognitive decline of any kind, and that she'd scored at the ceiling of the instrument for her age band. Cabler asked whether a person could be sharp and still be vulnerable to influence. The doctor said, yes, absolutely. And Cabler sat down looking like he'd landed one. And for about 90 seconds I thought we were in real trouble. Then Marguerite said, "Your Honor, the residence has an integrated security system that's been recording continuously since 2017. We've submitted the relevant footage." I watched my brother's face when she said the year. They played December, and there it was on a screen in a Kentucky courtroom, Lonnie's car at the gate, Lonnie in the front room, Lonnie sitting down without being asked. And then, with clean audio, my brother asking me for a specific sum of money, and the judge's eyebrows moving very slightly when the figure came out of the speaker, and then his face when I said no, and then him leaving, and there is no version of that footage where the man walking to that car is a concerned sibling. Nobody watching it thought that. He walks like a man whose meeting went badly. The gallery was silent. Then Marguerite said, "There's one more item. The company's main line records inbound and outbound calls with an audible notification at the start. Standard practice since 2014 for the leasing division." Mr. Mead's counsel called that line on January 6th to request contact information. Cabler stood up fast. The judge told him to sit down. They played it, and you could hear the notification tone at the top, plain as a bell, and then a receptionist, and then hold music for 11 seconds, and then two men talking, because Cabler had put the phone down on a desk without hanging it up, and my son's voice said, "And I'm going to give it to you exactly, because I have listened to it more times than I should have. I'm not saying he's not fine. He's probably fine. The question is whether a judge that age is going to want to believe a rich old lady's clean, or whether we get some traction on the sympathy of it." And Cabler's voice said something muffled, and Bryce said, "Because if she signs anything before we get in front of somebody, there's nothing left to argue about." And then the hold music came back on. 11 seconds of it, in a completely silent courtroom. I want to tell you what happened in my body, because it was not what I expected. I did not feel vindicated. I felt like something dropped out of me, because up until that recording played, I had been carrying, and I hadn't admitted this to myself, not once, not in 4 months, a small, stupid, load-bearing hope that some percentage of this was actually about worry, that my son was frightened for his father and had gone about it in the worst possible way. And the tape put a number on it, and the number wasn't 0, but it wasn't what I'd been hoping either. If she signs anything before we get in front of somebody, that's a man protecting an inheritance. That's not a man protecting his father. I looked over at him, and he had his hand over his mouth. Both elbows on the table, one hand over his mouth, staring at the middle distance about 4 feet in front of him. Lonnie, in the second row, had gone the color of dishwater. The judge let the silence sit for what I'd estimate was 6 or 7 seconds, which in a courtroom is roughly a geologic age. Then she said, "Mr. Cabler." Response? And Cabler did his best. He said the recording lacked context. He said his client's concerns were sincere and that strategy discussions between attorney and client don't reflect motive. And the judge said she appreciated the explanation. Then she dismissed the petition with prejudice and referred the affidavit to the county attorney's office for review of the sworn statements. The gavel came down, and the radiator knocked, and it was 10:41 inches the morning. In the hallway afterward, Bryce came to me. He'd sent Cabler ahead. He was alone, which was more than I expected of him. He looked like somebody had let the air out. "Dad." I waited. "I don't." He stopped and started over twice, and then he said, "Some of it was worry. I need you to know that some of it was actually worry." And I said, "I believe you. Some of it was." And that landed on him harder than if I'd told him he was a liar. I watched it land. Then he said the true thing, the one I'd been asking him for since 1997. He said, "You told me you were coming for my birthday when I was 14, and you didn't come. And you called and you had a reason, and the reason was true. And I sat on the front steps in Tulsa until 9:30 at night. And that's it. That's the whole ledger. 26 years of it started on a set of concrete steps in Oklahoma." I said, "I remember that weekend, and I've thought about it more than you'd guess." He nodded. I said, "But Bryce, that boy on the steps doesn't get to file a petition. What you did in October was a choice a 40-year-old man made. What you did in January was a choice a 40-year-old man made twice." He said, "I know." And I said, "You want to know what happens now? Time and honesty. And I'm going to need to see something different than what I've seen over a long enough stretch that I can trust it isn't a performance." I looked at him. That's not a punishment. That's just how long it actually takes. He didn't argue. That surprised me. Maybe losing in a room like that takes something out of a person that losing an argument doesn't. Lonnie called that night and talked for 14 minutes and spent 11 of them on justifications before he got somewhere near the neighborhood of sorry. The county attorney eventually declined to prosecute on a technical sufficiency issue, which I felt complicated about. I told him I'd asked for nothing further, and that I wanted the same from him that I'd asked from my son. Adelaide and I sat in the library that night with the fire going. She asked how I was. I said tired and relieved, and something else I couldn't name. She said, "Do you regret any of it?" And I said no, that I'd rather know who people are, even when who they are is a disappointment. She said Hal used to say the worst thing a crisis does is clarify. Because once you've seen something clearly, you don't get to go back to not seeing it. Then she said, "You've been steadier through this than I expected." And I said, "You had a camera system." And she laughed. A real one, loud and surprised. The kind she almost never gave up. I did have a camera system. The partnership agreement closed in April. Managing partner, Ferris Land Company, with a defined path to the succession structure. Tess and Aaron flew in and shook my hand and told me they were relieved their grandmother had found somebody, and they meant it. And I could tell they meant it because neither of them asked a single question about the terms. The work is hard. I make mistakes. Adelaide corrects me without any theater at all, which turns out to be worth more than kindness. Bryce and I had dinner in July at a place on Frankfurt Avenue, halfway between. 3 hours. He didn't want anything. He told me things about Tulsa I'd never heard. I told him things about 1,997 he'd never heard. We didn't fix it. 26 years doesn't dissolve over catfish. But we started. And last October, almost exactly a year out, I asked Vernon to run me down to the pavilion. No appointment. I just wanted to go. I sat in that same chair by the south window. Tuesday afternoon. Busy. The usual traffic of people at various stages of worry. I sat there about 20 minutes. And a man came in on his own, maybe 65, holding his elbow against his ribs, doing that thing with his face that men do in public when they're holding something together with both hands. He sat 2 chairs down and looked at the floor. I waited a bit. Then I said, "Rough one?" He looked up, startled that anybody had spoken. We talked for 50 minutes. His wife, a diagnosis that was manageable and had still felt, the first week, like the end of the world. I didn't offer him a car or a company or anything at all. I just sat there and let him work it out loud. When they called his name, he looked different. Not fixed. Less alone. We fund a program there now. It's small, and it's got a boring name, and it's 12 trained volunteers who sit in that lobby on rotating shifts, and their entire job is to notice the person who came in with somebody and is leaving without them. Adelaide picked the number 12. She said one for every hour of a shift somebody's daughter once waited. So here's what I've got. The mistake most of us make isn't trusting the wrong person. It's building a life where there's only one name on the list. I had one name. I had one person who could get me home from a hospital, and when that person didn't come, the entire structure went down, because there was no second column. 29 years of showing up for strangers, and I never once built a bench for myself. That's not a moral failing. That's just what happens to men my age. Over about 30 years, one declined invitation at a time. And the other thing, which is Adelaide's, and it's the more useful one, when you help somebody, give them a job. She didn't offer me a ride. She asked me to push a chair. That's the whole reason I'm not still sitting in that lobby. Pride will refuse a gift and accept a task every single time. And if you have somebody in your life who won't take help, a parent, a friend, somebody who's proud and stuck, stop offering to times. Do time something for them and start asking them to do something with you. So here's the specific thing you can do this week, and it takes about 10 minutes. Write down 3 names. Not one. 3 people who could come get you if something went sideways on a Tuesday. If you can only get to one, that's the most important thing you'll find out this month. And you're not stuck with it. Call somebody you've let drift and put something on the calendar. That's how a second name gets on a list. There isn't another way. And then the question I'd like you to actually sit in for a second, instead of scrolling past. Who in your life has already left you somewhere, and did you tell yourself it was fine? Because I did. Bryce had been leaving me somewhere for years in smaller ways, and every single time I said times he's busy, that's normal. Kids grow up. October wasn't the beginning of anything. October was just the first time it happened somewhere, with a nurse and a waiting room. Now I'd like to hear from you. Honestly. Comment 1 if you think I did right by getting in that car with a stranger, at 63, half blind, without knowing a thing about her, because plenty of people will tell you that's how the times, other times, kind of story starts. Comment 2 if you think the moment that actually mattered was refusing my brother in December, saying no out loud to family for the first time in my life, and that everything after came from that. And comment 3 If the part staying with you is the hallway, whether I should have forgiven my son on the spot when he told me about those front steps in Tulsa, or whether asking him for time was the right call, I read them. All of them. It's become the best part of my week. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I spent 29 years inside about 400 square miles of one county, so the notion of this landing in somebody's kitchen on the other side of the planet still doesn't quite fit in my head. And if somebody unexpected ever sat down beside you, a stranger, a neighbor, somebody with no reason on earth to bother, tell me about it below, and use their name. Say it out loud somewhere. Adelaide Ferris watched a room for 2 hours because her daughter once sat in one alone, and she never told a single soul she did it. If this one got to you, stay with me and subscribe. I tell these because there's somebody watching right now sitting in a chair somewhere doing arithmetic and coming up short, and I'd like them to know the list isn't finished yet. There's another next week. Bring the coffee. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Louisville to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.